Welcome to Highline Excel 2016 class video number 22. Hey, if you want to download this file, Business 218 Video 22 Start, or the finished file, or the PDF file, click on the link below the video. Hey, we have a great video here. We're going to talk more about Power Pivot, and in specific, we want to learn more about data modeling and DAX formulas. Now, let's go look at our end result first. I'm over here in the finished file. We actually need to calculate total revenue, total cost of goods sold, and gross profit using DAX formulas. And over here, we're going to need to calculate gross profit percentage and gross profit percentage compared to the same period last year. And we're going to do all those calculations with DAX formulas. Now, certainly, we could calculate total revenue just with a pivot table. And in fact, earlier in this class, we did that. But let's go look at our data sets. When you download your files, there will be a zip folder called Video 22 Import Excel Files. And inside, there'll be two folders. I'm going to double click on Start. Here are the first three files that we're going to import into the data model. Let's go look at one of them. This is from Flying Boom Incorporated for the year 2014. We have date, product, revenue discount, net cost equivalent, country code, and units. So we do not have the actual amount for the transaction. So it's actually something we're going to have to calculate. Now, you can see through this column, sometimes we don't give a discount on our retail price. And sometimes they do get a discount on their retail price. Similarly, we're going to have to calculate cost of goods sold, and we have a standard cost, and we're going to use our net cost equivalent. Sometimes when we multiply 1.01 times the standard cost, we get an amount bigger than the standard cost. Sometimes when we have 0.98 and we multiply that by our standard cost, we'll get a cost less than the standard cost. So those are a bunch of different calculations we're going to have to do with DAX formulas. Now let's look down at the bottom of this data set control down arrow. So here there's like 800,000 records. I'm going to close this. So we have three different files here, and later we'll have more files that will dump into this folder, and then we'll update our data model, and all the reports will update. Now let's go over to the start file, because we still have a couple more tables we need to look at. On D country, we have a lookup table, country code, and country. Remember, over in the actual transaction data set, we have country code, but we want for our report to show country. Not only that, but over on D product, we have a lookup table for our products where we have retail price, standard cost, and category. So these tables will have to get into the data model also. And of course, as we've seen earlier in the class, we'll create relationships between these lookup tables, or in databasing, we call them dimension tables, and our transaction table, or in databasing, we call them fact tables. Now, before we start importing all those tables and doing DAX formulas, let's go to the PDFs and go to the section, what is data modeling? So data modeling is going to first be importing data into Power Pivot data model as proper data sets, either using Power Query when we need to clean, transform, or when we have lots of external files and we need to consolidate them into a single table like we do in this example. And then we're going to use the Add to Data Model button in the Power Pivot Ribbon tab if the data is small and it's in Excel. Second, we're going to create relationships between the dimension tables and fact tables, or lookup tables and transaction tables. Third, we'll create our DAX formulas. We've seen how to create a simple sum function DAX measure in earlier videos. In this video, we'll see a few more DAX measures. We'll also learn how to create calculated columns, which will really come in handy for us in this example, because if we have millions of rows of data, since we can't have that in an Excel sheet, we can't build a helper column like for calculating revenue. So we'll get to see calculated columns. And then step 4 in data modeling, we're going to hide all tables and fields that are not going to be used in our pivot tables. We'll still have access to them. They just won't show up in our pivot table field list. Then we'll create our pivot tables and pivot charts. Then we'll refresh our data model when the source data changes. And then we edit the data model as necessary. All right, let's go back to Excel. All right, so we're going to start this off. If we have a bunch of Excel files to import, just as we saw last video, we go to Data, Get and Transform, which is in 2016 the group in the data ribbon that represents Power Query. Now we go over to New Query, From File, and down to From Folder. All of this should be familiar. We did this last video. I'm going to click on Browse. We're going to browse down to the Start folder. Remember, there's 3 Excel files in there. What we're telling Power Query is to please import everything in that Start folder. I'm going to click OK. Click OK. Click Edit if you get this intermediate step. Immediately, I'm going to come over and name this query. This name will be the name of the query in case we need to edit it later, but it will also be the name of the fact table or our transaction table over in the data model. I'm going to call it F Transactions. The F means fact, and then Enter. Now, last video, we had to worry about filtering out different file extensions, and we also had to extract certain parts of the file name, but we don't need to do any of that in this video. We're only going to have .xlsx files, and we do not need information from the file name. So I simply come over to Content, right-click, Remove Other Columns. Now, these are Excel files in this column here. And because Excel files have lots of different objects, like we talked about the last couple of videos, we need to add a new column. So I go over to Add Columns, Add Custom Column. And in order to get at all that data, we're going to create a new column called Get Excel Data tab. And we're going to use the Power Query function, Excel.Workbook. Open parentheses. Remember, case sensitive, and it has to have that dot. Now we double click on Content. And now I want to promote all of the headers in every single Excel table to a single set of field names in our data model. So I type a comma, and in the second argument for Excel.Workbook, I, in lowercase, type true, close parentheses. Now I can click OK. Now we don't need content. Right-click, remove this column. Now I'm going to click the Expand button. And there's our different objects we talked about the last couple of videos. I'm going to uncheck Use Original Column Name as Prefix and click OK. Now, last couple of videos, we had to filter these to get just sheets or use the sheet name, but we don't need to do that here. There's only going to be exactly one sheet in each workbook. So I come to Data. I'm going to click on Data, right-click, Remove Other Columns. Now I can go to the Expand button, and there are our field names from the tables. We see these here because we used that true in the second argument of Excel.Workbook. Uncheck that, click OK. And just like that, we have our field names promoted, and there's no rogue or extra field names down below. Now, we could click a particular filter button on a field that has the fewest number of unique records. And I'm going to come down here. There's a lot of records here. I'm going to say Load More because I want to see a unique list. And if I scroll down, I can see there is no country code extra field name here. I'm going to click OK. Now, we very carefully need to go through each column. And notice it has a little icon there that says, I don't know what data type this is. So we want to, on the Home ribbon, go over to Transform. And I want to click on Data Type and point to Date. Now I can see a little icon for date. Now I'm clicking on Product. I'm going to change this to Data Type Text. And there it is. It has an ABC icon. Revenue discount. This could be anywhere from 0 to about 0.5 or 0.6% revenue discount. So these are definitely data type decimal numbers. And there it is, the little icon for decimal numbers. Net cost equivalent, same data type. We're going to say decimal number. Country code is text. Units, these are definitely whole numbers. All right, so we have all of our fields with the right data type, all of our records. We need all of these columns for our analysis, so we're not going to eliminate one of them. We have the right name. Now I need to come up to Close and Load To, and I select the second one here to open up the dialog box. I'm only creating a connection, and I want to say Add this to the data model. We definitely could not dump this in a table. In the first 3 files, there's about 2.7 million records. I'm going to click Load. And there it is. It took a while, but there it is, about 2.7 million records loaded. This is our workbook query. We can come back and edit later. Of course, if it wasn't showing, we could say Show Queries. Now we need to go to the data model. I'm going to notice that data is there, and we have Manage Data Model. So the keyboard is Alt-A, and that always gets us to the data ribbon. But notice it's DM, so that's an easy one to remember. A because it's data, DM because it's data model, DM. All right, here's our Manage Data Model window. And you can see down here we definitely have all of the records. We could mess around with the columns if we want. We don't really need to change any of this, but you could. You could come up and say, hey, the format is a straight date instead of date and time. Now we have our one table here. We need to go back over to Excel, Alt-Tab, and we go to the Power Pivot ribbon tab. And we're going to use the Add to Data Model. But now I want to go over to, actually, I'm going to add the D country first. Now I've already converted this to a table and given it a smart name. That way, that'll be the name over in our data model. All right, so go to Power Pivot, Add to Data Model. And there it is. You can see a little link, which means that's linked to Excel. Let's go back over to Excel. Click on D Product Sheet. Click in a single cell. This already has a smart name. There it is, D Product. Power Pivot. I'm going to say Add to Data Model. And there it is. There's a link D product. All right, now we have one last dimension table or lookup table that we need to add. Now, before we add that dimension table, we want to come over here to the PDFs, and here it is, Calendar Table, Dimension Table. I want to click on this and talk about what a calendar table is. Now, a calendar table will have a unique list of dates, and it will have things like month name, fiscal quarter, fiscal year, all the different ways we might group sales numbers based on certain date categories. Now, you might be asking the question, why do we need a calendar table? Why can't we just use the Group by Date feature? Now, we used that feature earlier in this class. And actually, Group by Date is a brand new feature in Excel 2016 for the data model. It used to be that we could not right-click Group and Group by Date in the data model. But you can do that now. Now, the drawback is that it only has month, year, and a standard quarter. Well, one of the requirements for our reports in this video is that we do fiscal quarter. So the Group by Date feature will not work. That's where a calendar table comes in. Now, a calendar table has a few advantages. Actually, the biggest advantage is that we have access to time intelligence DAX functions like same period last year. One of the calculations we're going to make is we're going to see the percentage change from one date period to another. And the beauty of the same period last year DAX function, which, by the way, is not in a normal pivot table and it is not in an Excel spreadsheet. This function can look at any date, whether a day, a quarter, a fiscal quarter, a year, and it will automatically know to go back to the previous year and get the previous amount. That way, we'll have a function that we can always use to compare between two periods from two different years. Another advantage, of course, is that we can calculate fiscal quarter using what's called a calculated column in our calendar table for our fiscal quarter. And then also number 3, for big data, anytime you have dimension tables or lookup tables and fact tables, the actual columnar database and DAX formulas work most efficiently. Now, a few requirements for our calendar table. You have to have the first column in the calendar table has to have a unique list of all the dates from earliest to latest with no missing dates. And then, of course, we'll create our calculated columns, and we'll calculate month name, fiscal quarter, and fiscal year. All right, let's go back over to Excel. And there's a sheet called Sheet 1. I'm going to double-click that sheet and call it D Calendar and Enter. Now in Cell 1, I'm going to type Date, Control-Enter, Control-B, Enter. And I've already looked through the data set, and the earliest date we have is 1/1/2014. Control-Enter. Now I need to get from this first date all the way to 12/31/2016. So we're going to learn an amazing trick in Excel. Home ribbon. I have the cell with the first date selected. So home ribbon, over to editing, fill, and I'm going to click series. Now this dialog box shows up, but I'm going to show you a faster way to get to that. Anytime you have your first date, you actually point to the little fill handle in the lower right-hand corner. And when you push your cursor, when you see your crosshair or angry rabbit cursor, right click and drag down one and then back. And instantly, a secret menu pops up. Now I'm going to do that again. It's right click, drag, drag back, and up pops our secret drop down with series. So there we go. Now I want to fill this series down the column, and the step value is going to be 1 day at a time. And watch this. The stop value, you just type your final date, 12/31/2016. Now it doesn't really quite fit, but there it is, that date. When I click OK, instantly I have the full column. If I control down arrow, you can see we have all the way to 12/31. Control home. I'm going to convert this to a table because if we're going to import it into the data model from an Excel sheet, it's got to be an Excel table. Control T and Enter. We want to make sure and name this. I come up here or use the keyboard Alt JTA, and I'm going to call this D Calendar and Enter. Now, why is it always required that you have an Excel table, whether you go into Power Query or Power Pivot Data Model? Of course, because if this changes, this object is a table and it's dynamic. When this changes later, the data model will recognize it. All right, now I click in a single cell, Power Pivot, and Add to Data Model. And there it is. Link D Calendar. Anytime we want to update any of the Excel tables, we simply come to Link Table and click that, which we will do later. All right, now we have all 4 tables. Now we need to build relationships. I'm going to go over to Diagram View. We're going to put the fact table in the middle. I'm going to surround the dimension tables or lookup tables around the edges. And actually, the fact table is going to have some other columns later. And here's the D Calendar. And actually, the D Calendar will have a bunch of calculated columns later. But now let's build our relationships. Country code gets dragged to country code. And instantly, we have a one-to-many relationship. There's a single country code in the first column of our lookup or dimension table. Over here, there's many repeats. Now let's do the same for product. There we go. We have many products over here, right, because we sold many quad boomerangs and aspens and sunsets. But over here, we have a unique list in this lookup or dimension table that will allow us to look up and get retail price, standard costs, and category for our DAX formulas that will be over in the F transaction table. And finally, let's link date. Lots of repeat dates over here. We'll have a single date, and we'll have things like fiscal quarter, fiscal year over here. All right, so this is part of our data modeling, building relationships. I'm actually going to drag this up a little bit. We can go back to Data View. Step 1 is importing the tables. Back to Data View. Step 2 is building relationships between the tables, dimension or lookup tables, and our factor transaction table. Now back to Data View. Step 3 is our DAX formulas. Now we're going to build DAX measures and DAX calculated columns. We're going to start with calculated columns in the D Calendar table. Now the first column is that unique list of dates. I am going to add some formatting to this. Go to the Home, over to Format, and click on that Date Format. Now, our first calculated column is going to be month number. Then we'll do month name, and then fiscal quarter, fiscal year, and so on. Now, to create a calculated column in the D calendar table, I'm simply going to double-click where it says Add Column, and I'm going to name it Month Number and Enter. Now, similar to our Excel table formula nomenclature that we learned earlier in the class, there's no cell references in a column. We're going to create our formula here, and it will automatically calculate down, and it will look the same in every single cell. Now, notice when I click in the first cell, there's an equal sign. We actually have to create all of our formulas up in the formula bar. Now, we want month number, and over here in DAX, there's a function that works the same as over in Excel, the month function. It simply wants the date. Now, I want to show you something. I am allowed to click on the first cell, but notice it only puts in the field name in square brackets. That is not going to be our convention. We're going to reserve square brackets without a table name only for measures. So I'm going to backspace, and I'm going to type it out. DC for D calendar, down arrow, there is table name, and in square brackets, the field name. Now notice there's icons. That means function. That means the whole table, and that icon with a little shaded column or field means the entire field. So there it is, exactly like the syntax we used back in Excel tables. Now when I close parentheses and hit Enter, it auto-populates down the column. In every single cell, the formula will look exactly the same. We could actually scroll down and notice it's working. When it sees June, it delivers a 6. Now, two different types of DAX formulas. This is called a calculated column. Well, how in the world does it work? That is not a cell reference. How did that whole field reference or column reference know to look at that particular date? And as I go down, notice when it gets down to here, it's looking at that date. In DAX, it's called row context. That means every one of these calculated columns knows, because it's in this row, to look at that date. Row context is how calculated columns calculate. Now I'm going to scroll all the way up. Now we already know that because we've already used this exact syntax over in Excel when we used the Excel table feature. But that's the technical term, row context. Now let's calculate our next column. Double click. I'm going to call this simply month, even though it's going to be month name, because later we're going to use this column in our field list in the pivot table, but we'll hide this one. So I'm going to hit Enter. Now, if I click in the top cell, if we were in Excel, we would use the text function. We would click on the entire column, and then we would use the custom number format, MMM. Well, guess what? Over here in DAX, they didn't call this function text. They called it format. So format is going to do the same thing as the text function. It wants the value, which is the whole column, DC, down arrow to get table name and field name in square brackets. Notice it says value, comma, and then the format, just as over in Excel, custom number format has to be in double quotes, MMM. Now, if we put 3 M's, it will show us 3-letter abbreviation. If I did 4, it would show me the full month name. But I'm going to do 3, and double quote, close parentheses. Now, when I enter, there's our formula. Row context tells this calculated column to calculate a different item for each row or record in the table. Now, I want to build a quick pivot table and show you that there's a problem with this calculated column. I'm going to click Pivot Table over in the data model and just click OK. I'm not even going to name the sheet. Drag the field list over, and D calendar, I'm going to drag month down to rows. And lo and behold, it's sorting alphabetically. And that is not what we want. Now I'm going to come down to the sheet, right-click, delete. And I'm going to delete it. Back over to our calendar table, no problem. Once you calculate month name, we can come up to the Sort and Filter group. Sort by column. Actually, I can just click the button. And watch this. You say sort column month. That's this one with our text. By which column? Month number. The whole reason that we calculated month number in the first place was so that we had a hierarchy from 1 to 12 that we could later use to sort our month name column. So I click OK. Now notice this is more complicated than the group by date feature, but when we're doing advanced calculations in the data model like fiscal month, fiscal year, and we'll see some other calculations, this is how we do it. Now if I create a quick pivot table, click OK, you can see sure enough calendar, month, and it's going to sort perfect. Right click, delete. All right, now our next column is going to be year. So double click year and enter. I see my equal sign up here, and guess what? They named this DAX function smartly. Year, I say DC, down arrow to get the full date field, close parentheses, and enter. And there is the year. Now we're going to calculate fiscal quarter and fiscal year in a couple steps. And the first step is calculating in the standard quarter. Now, back in video number 9, we did all of these calculations in an Excel spreadsheet. The same exact functions and formula logic can be used here. All right, so for quarter, I'm going to double-click Add Column. And this is just standard quarter and enter. Now, as we did back in video number 9, we said equals, well, I need to take the month number, so DC, down arrow to get month number, and I'm going to divide by 3. That was one of our tricks. Now notice 1 divided by 3 is 0.33. When we get down to the second month, it's 0.666. And when we get down to the third month, it's 1. So what do? We rounded the calculation up. So up here in the formula bar, there's a round up in DAX, just as there is over in Excel. And comma. Number of digits, we round to the integer with a 0 and enter. And so that gives us our quarter. If we look through our table all the way through the third month, is quarter number 1. And of course, when it gets to 4, it is 2. Now we come over, double click, and this will be fiscal quarter and enter. Well, our fiscal quarter is defined as January, February, March, is the fourth quarter of the previous year. Now remember, back in video number 9, we talked about why fiscal quarters exist. Companies pick the slowest time of the year to do financial statements, oftentimes associated with tax times. I'll give you another example. Here at Highline College, our fiscal year starts July 1st. That's in summer. That's the slowest time when they can do all of their financial statements. All right, so for our company, the first 3 months are quarter 4. So I'm going to use the DAX if function equals if, and our logical test is going to be month number. So DC, down arrow to month number. Anytime that is less than 4, that means 1, 2, 3, comma. Then for the value if true, wait a second, this is the if DAX function. Over in Excel, it says value if true. Here it says result if true. Well, 1, 2, or 3 months is the fourth quarter for last year, comma. Result if false, the standard quarter, which is DC, down arrow to get quarter, minus 1. That means quarter 2 will be 1. Quarter 3 will be 2. There we go. Close parentheses and enter. And so now we have our fiscal quarters. If we scroll down, all of these are 4 because these months need to be associated with the previous year's financial statements. But down here, April 1st is the first day in our new fiscal year. Now we need to calculate fiscal year and enter. We can use similar logic. Equals if DC, and if the month number is less than 4, then I need to take the year, so DC, down arrow to get the year, minus 1, so it's going back to the previous year. Otherwise, result if false, DC, this year, or the calendar year. Close parentheses and enter. So now we can scroll down and clearly see 13, and then 14 is associated with June, May, April, all the way to the following year, January, February, and March. Now we have one last column. I'm going to double click, and this will be fiscal period. So this will be the year, the fiscal year, and the fiscal quarter combined. So right here, I'm going to come up, DC down, and I want to start with fiscal year. That way, these labels will always sort correctly. And then I'm going to join it just as we would over in Excel, double quotes, space, capital Q, and double quote, and I'm going to join it to DC, the fiscal quarter. And there is our text formula over here in a calculated column. When I hit Enter, that will help us get the quarters and years to sort in a pivot table. Now I can see I actually want a dash here, so I'm going to come over and edit this. Dash, space, and then Enter. And there we go. This is our calendar table with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 calculated columns. All right, now we have one last calculated column we like to create, and we need to go over to the F transaction table. Now remember, we don't have revenue, right? So we need to look up the product. So this would be Fun Fly, and we're going to have to get the price from the D product table. Retail price column has the price we want to get. Back over on F transaction, then we need to multiply whatever the price is, not times the discount, but times 1 minus the discount, and then multiply it by units. Now, we're going to do this two ways. We're going to do it with a calculated column and then a sum function to add the calculated column, which we can then use in our pivot table. And then I'll show you a method where it's not required to use a calculated column. So we'll start with calculated column. I'm going to double click and call this revenue and Enter. Now we come up to our formula bar. Now we'd like to use VLOOKUP to look up product name, right, and retrieve the price. There's no VLOOKUP over here in DAX. Luckily, there's a relationship between the fact table and our product table. So guess what? There's a relationship, so we use the related function. And the cool thing about this is it knows there's a relationship. So I simply type DP for the product table and arrow down to retail price and tab. Guess what? Related will do the rest. And how is it going to do it? Well, remember, row context will allow related to see each one of the product names. And then because there's a relationship, it'll automatically know to go to the other table and get retail price. When I close parentheses and Enter, there it is, the retail price for every product. Now we need to multiply this times, and I need revenue discount, but not quite. I need in parentheses 1 minus, and then FT to get to our fact table, down arrow to revenue discount and tab, close parentheses. When I hit Enter, that will give me, for this case, there's no revenue discount. But further down, there are definitely some products that have discounts. So there we have a net price for one product. But now we need to finish this. Times, and then units. So FT, and then down arrow to units. When I hit Enter, there's the revenue for each row or transaction. Now, I definitely want to scroll down. And here's a transaction. Looks like 1.98 millionth row here, our transaction. Here, we need to round this. And just like over in Excel, here in DAX, we have a round function, which will do the standard rounding. There's the number. We come to the end, comma, and we're rounding to the penny. So we put a 2, close parentheses. And when I hit Enter, instantly the whole 2.7 million rows gets our updated formula. All right. Now we have our calculated column. Now I want to come down here and create a DAX measure that we can drop into the pivot table. Now, we have a couple ways we can create DAX measures. Earlier in the class, if we go over to Excel, we went to Power Pivot, Calculations, Measures, and did New Measure. And this dialog box is great. It's like one-stop shopping. Tell it what the table is, the measure name, a description, the formula, and then the number formatting. But let's learn an alternative for creating DAX measures. You simply choose whatever table you want the measure to appear in over in the pivot table field list. So I'm choosing F transaction. click in a cell, come up to the formula bar, and you don't type an equal sign. If you remember back to our prerequisite class, Business 216, when we did access formulas, in our query window, we had to type the name of the new field, a colon, and then our formula. So up here, I'm going to type total revenue, and then a colon, and then an equal sign, and then SUM. So it's very important that you have the colon and the equal sign. That's called an assignment operator to get this formula to work. FT, and I'm going to arrow down to my new calculated column. Close parentheses. Now, one disadvantage of creating it over here in the measure grid is that we had to know to put a colon and an equal sign. We didn't have to know that over in the dialog box. Now, when I hit Enter, you could see it down here. We still have to add number formatting. So now I can just use in the home ribbon formatting group, I can select $, and that adds the formatting. If we wanted to add a description from the measure grid, we'd have to right-click Description. And now we could type our description. DAX measure with some function to add calculated column. I better put an N there. And the name of that calculated column is revenue. Click OK. Now, just to see that it does the same exact thing, let's go back over to Excel. And if you ever need to edit and you want to use the dialog box, you come over to Measures and then Manage Measures. And all of your measures will be listed here. I can click on it and edit. And sure enough, there it is. There's the table, there's the name, there's the description, the formula, and there's the number formatting. Click OK, click Close, Alt-Tab. Now, I want to show you an alternative to creating a calculated column and then a DAX measure. We're going to use something called the SUMX function. Now, in order to calculate each one of these revenues and then add them, we actually had to go through each row in this table using row context and calculate each individual amount. If we go down and use most DAX functions for a measure, it can't do row context. DAX measures are good at filter context, which means they see the criteria in a pivot table. But actually, there are a few functions that can iterate over an entire table and calculate each value for each row or record in a table. They're called the X functions. So we're going to use SUMX. So I'm going to come up here. Actually, before we do that, watch this. Here's really what it's going to do. All we have to do is tell the SUMX the table that it should iterate over and the formula that we would have used in a calculated column. So watch this. I'm going to cheat. I'm going to come up here and copy this entire thing without the equal sign. Control-C, Escape. And now I'm going to come down here. Up in the formula bar, we have to type a name first. And I'm actually not going to use this formula later on, but I still want to know its total revenue. I can't type total space revenue because I already have that name down here. So I'm going to use total revenue with no space. We still have to do our assignment operator, colon, equal sign, and then SUMX. So if you don't want to do the helper column, we can use SUMX to actually calculate that same formula, but down in the measure grid. We need to tell the SUMX which table to iterate over. It's FT. And notice I'm selecting the entire table. There it is. So table, comma, and the expression. That's the whole formula we would have used, Control-V, if we had done a helper column. Now, we're doing both of them here just to illustrate, right? But that's it. That's how you get row context down in a measure. Close parentheses and Enter. Now we can go up and apply a number formatting. Right-click Description, and I'm going to add a description. DAX measure with SUMX to iterate over the F transaction table, row context, and calculate the revenue formula row by row. And then I listed the actual formula. Click OK. If we drop these into the pivot table, they both give us exactly the same answer. Now, when would you do a calculated column, and when would you do a straight DAX measure like this with an X function? By the way, we use SUMX. There's average X, max X, and a number of other X functions that can iterate over tables. Well, for a calculated column, this will be stored in the columnar database. It'll take a unique list and store it, and that uses RAM. That means when you load the file, it's loaded into RAM, random access memory. If we do a straight SUMX, the values are all created exactly the same as if there was a calculated column here, but it's not stored in RAM. Those values are only generated when we drop the DAX measure into the pivot table or the criteria in the pivot table changes. That means the central processing unit will calculate all of those values. Now, for our small data sets, even millions and millions of rows, it's not going to really matter. When you get up into 50 million or 100 million rows, then you might have to figure out which one is better, storing the values in RAM or getting the central processing unit to calculate this when you drop it into a pivot table. So really, it's your preference on smaller data sets which one you'll use. Now, we actually have a few other calculations we want to make. I want to calculate total cost of goods sold. Now, I'm going to do this one straight as a SUMX. What we're going to need to do is we're going to look up the product, but we're going to get standard cost. So there's the standard cost right there for each product. Then we're going to multiply it not by 1 minus. This was an actual discount. This is the net cost equivalent. So here the person paid 86 pennies for every $1. And then down further, there's some net cost equivalents that are larger than 1, which means you're paying more than the standard cost. We need to take that times the price and then the units. All right, so I'm going to come down here. And watch, if I just click down here, as soon as I start typing, I jump up to the formula bar. Total cost of goods sold, colon, equal sign, SUMX. I need to tell it which table to iterate over. This is the FT transaction, comma, and the expression. Well, we know we're going to have to round all these, so I'm going to put the round. Then I know I'm going to have to look up using related, and this is the DP down arrow. We want standard cost. So related is simply looking up the standard cost, and because it's sitting in the SUMX, it'll iterate and get every single standard cost for every product in this table. And I'm going to multiply it times net cost equivalent, FT down arrow to net cost equivalent tab, times FT and the units tab, comma, and now I need to round it to number of digits 2, close parentheses on the round, and I'm watching my screen tips just like I would over in Excel. I see that's the whole expression. I wish that we could click on this like we can in Excel and highlight everything, but won't let us do that. Close parentheses, and there is my SUMX that will iterate over this entire table. But down here in the measure grid, when I hit Enter, there's the total cost of goods sold. Add some number formatting. Right-click description. DAX measure with SUMX to iterate over the F transaction table row context and calculate cost of goods sold formula row by row. All right, now we have one last formula we're going to calculate. And actually, we're going to calculate gross profit. And it's going to be total revenue minus total cost of goods sold. And we'll get to see an advantage of creating formulas over here in the measure grid. Type. So total gross profit, colon, equal sign. And now I need to take one measure minus another measure. And remember, our convention is to only use square brackets. But watch this. I can simply click on the cell with the DAX measure, and look at that. It appears in square brackets, minus, and I'm going to click on the other cell. That is pretty beautiful. Now when I hit Enter, I'm going to add some number formatting and a description. DAX measure for total gross profit calculated from DAX measures, total revenue and total cost of goods sold. Click OK. All right, so step 3, we started out over in the D calendar. We calculated a bunch of DAX calculated columns in the calendar table. Then in F transaction, we calculated one DAX calculated column and a number of measures, including learning how to use SUMX to iterate. Now, step 4 is we want to go over to diagram view and look. Now, notice we have a bunch of new measures here, and I love these icons, which appear in Excel 2016 or later for our DAX measures. Now, what we want to do here is hide any fields or tables that we're going to not need over in our pivot table. Now, we need all the tables, but let's just come over here. I'm never going to use country code, so I'm going to select that field, right-click, hide from client tool. Retail price, holding control and selecting standard cost, right-click, hide from client tools. You can see they're grayed out. That means they won't appear over in our pivot table field list. Now, we're not going to need any of the actual fields from the F transaction table. So I'm going to click on the first one. And before I click on the last one, I hold Shift and then right-click, hide from client tools. Now, I actually want to hide this one too. This is a measure. Right-click, hide from client tool. Remember, we just looked at how to do SUMX, and then this one was our sum of the calculated columns. So that's the one we're going to use. Now I come over here. I'm not going to need month number, and I'm holding the Control key, clicking on year and quarter. Right-click, hide from client tools. So over here in diagram view, we can see hidden fields and measures are gray. If we go back over to data view, watch this. The columns are actually grayed out. And if we go over to F transactions, all of these columns are hidden. And look at that measure 2. That means we're ready to build our pivot table and pivot chart reports. Now I'm over in the data model, so I'm going to click on the pivot table button. I want it in a new worksheet, so I'm going to hit Enter. And now let's expose all of the tables. And sure enough, there are a bunch of hidden columns. Now, this is our hard work of building a data model. We imported those tables, built relationships, built DAX calculated columns and measures, and then showed only the fields and tables that we want in our pivot table field list. Now we're going to create a number of pivot tables. And the first pivot table will be categories. So I'm going to click on category and drop down in rows. Instantly, I get my unique list. And now up here, there's our measures. And by the way, there's those icons that appear in Excel 2016. That F of X means that's a measure. Now I'm going to click, click, click. And sure enough, they get thrown down to the values area, 1, 2, 3. And there are our DAX measures: total revenue, total cost of goods sold, and total gross profit. That is amazing. And notice there's that number formatting. We applied it over there in the data model, and it shows up automatically in our pivot table. Now, what is a DAX measure doing? Remember, DAX measures are based on filter context. That means this entire field here, total revenue, is actually the same formula in each cell in the pivot table. But notice, when I'm in the cell right here, it sees the filter context, which in this case is the criteria in the row header. But that formula sees whatever criteria we drop into the row, column, filter, or slicer. Now, in particular, what the DAX measure does with the columnar database is in this cell right here, it sees competition. Now remember, we dragged that from the lookup or dimension table. So instantly, it would go down to the product table, and the product table would be filtered only down to category. That means there's one record here. That filter would carry over to the transaction table, and only the records for competition. That means when the DAX formula calculates over this table in the underlying columnar database, it's calculating over a much smaller table only for the records that contain category. That's one of the amazing things about DAX measures, columnar database, and our whole data model for how it can calculate quickly on big data. Now we want to do a couple things to this pivot table row labels. I'm going to go up to Design, Report Layout, Show in Tabular. Immediately, I'm going to go over to View and uncheck the grid lines, back to Design, and I'm going to pick some style like this one down here. Now I want to create a couple other pivot tables, and I think I'm going to click in H 3. And instead of going back to the data model to click the pivot table button, I'm simply going to use the keyboard Alt-N-V. And check this out. Because we have a data model, the default in 2016 is, hey, dialog button is already selected for that. And it has the cell, so I simply have to hit Enter. Now, our next pivot table is going to be based on fiscal year. So I'm going to drag it down to rows. And for this pivot table, we only want gross profit. So I send it down there. Design, report layout, show in tabular, and we'll use the same style. Now we have one more pivot table, maybe an L3, Alt-N-V, Enter. This one we're going to show products, so I'm going to drag it down to rows. And here I want all 3 measures, 1, 2, 3. Now for the time being, I'm going to close that. Design, report layout, show in tabular. Now one thing as I'm looking through here, notice there's a bunch of decimals showing, and I kind of don't want to see pennies in a high-level report like this. So this is one great benefit of using the data model and DAX measures. I'm going to go back to the data model, and watch this. I'm going to highlight all 4 cells and simply go up and decrease the decimals, 1, 2. And now when I go back to Excel, Alt-Tab, look at that. All of the DAX measures are updated to show 0 decimals. Now, I actually want 2 slicers for all 3 pivot tables. So I'm going to click in whichever pivot table, go up to Analyze, Slicer, go over to All. I want to say Fiscal Year, and I want Country. Click OK. Now, I'm going to mess with these in just a moment. But for the time being, I want to make one last, not pivot table, but a pivot chart based on fiscal year. So I'm going to click in this pivot table, Insert, Charts, and over to the line, and maybe this one right here. I do not need the legend. I'm going to click on it, Delete. I'm going to click on the title and type Fiscal Year Gross Profit and Enter. Right-click. Hide all field buttons. I don't need this axis here. Delete. I'm going to come over to the green plus data labels. We'll fix that in a little bit. Now, I want to name each one of these pivot tables and then connect them all to the slicer. So in turn, I'm going to right-click Pivot Table Options for each one of these. This one will be called Category Pivot, and I'm going to uncheck AutoFit. Click OK. Right-click Pivot Table Options. And this one will be called Fiscal Pivot. Uncheck AutoFit. Click OK. Right-click Pivot Table Options. And this one will be called Product Pivot. Uncheck AutoFit. Click OK. Now I'm going to come to the slicer. Right-click, and I'm going to point to Report Connections. And I'm going to check all 3 pivot tables. Click OK. Right-click Report Connect. Check all 3, click OK. I'm going to insert a bunch of rows above these pivot tables. Right-click, Insert. Move our slicer up here. Up under Slicer Options, I'm going to add 10 columns. Change the width. Right-click, Slicer Settings. I don't want to check Hide Items with no data. This slicer, how about 1, 2, 3 columns? Something like that wide. I want to fit it in between, and I'm actually going to cover up that pivot table. I don't want to show that pivot table. Move this chart up here. All right, now let's see if this works. I'm going to click on Bahamas, and everything is filtered. Unfilter everything, and I really want 14 holding. So I click on 14, hold Shift, and click on 16. So I'm going to click on the green plus Data Labels. There we go. There is our dashboard for now. Now, step 6 after building our reports is if the source data changes, we can refresh everything. So back over in Windows Explorer, there's our folder. Remember, we have Power Query and the data model pointing at Start. So I'm going to double-click Add Later, copy both of those, Control-C. And inside of Start, I'm going to Control-V. Now the data model is looking at Start, and it has new files. So now I go back over here, and I'm going to go to Data, refresh all, or use the keyboard Control-Alt-F5. And now if we look at our workbook query window here, we can see we now have 4.7 million records. That means it spans from 2014 to 18. Now if we look back over here, there is a problem. And we did this on purpose just to show that for our calendar table, if we control down arrow, there it's 2016. But it really needs to be 12/31/2018. So I'm going to do the same trick we did earlier. Right-click, drag down, drag back, and there's our secret menu. I point to Series. Now I want to fill this down the column, so I click Column. 1 day at a time, and our stop value is 12/31/2018, and Enter. There it is, Control down arrow, all the way to December 31st, 2018. Control Home. Now we can go back over to our data model. And if we go to our calendar table, it should have already updated. If it didn't, then you go to Link Table and select Update Selected. But if we go down to the bottom, sure enough, it has updated. That is amazing. Now we can go back to our pivot tables, and sure enough, everything is updated. Now I can hold Shift and click on 17. And there I have from 14 to 17 on my line chart. My pivot tables have updated, and I can slice and dice as I would like. Now that's the 6 steps, right? We imported our tables, built relationships, built formulas, hid whatever fields we didn't want on our pivot table field list, built all of our reports, and then updated when source data changes. But we have a data model, and let's say we want to create some more DAX formulas. We can do that. We can come back over here. We're going to go to F Transactions. Now we have 2 more formulas that we want to be able to drop into our pivot table. Now the first one, I simply want to take whatever the total gross profit is and divide it by total revenue to get gross profit percentage. But then I would like a second calculation for gross profit that shows me for a particular date period the change from the last period. So for example, if I have fiscal period 4 for 2015, I want to see what the percentage change is from quarter 4 from 2014. All right, so we'll start with gross profit percentage. I click in a cell. I come up to the formula bar, type my label, percent gross profit, colon, equal sign. Now I could just take division, right? Gross profit divided by total revenue, but instead I'm going to use a new DAX function, divide. It takes the numerator and the denominator, and I'm going to do our little trick. Numerator is total gross profit, and there it puts the measure in with our convention of square brackets, comma, the denominator, total revenue. Now if you leave the third argument empty, if there's an error, it will show nothing, close parentheses, and Enter. Now this is going to be a percentage, so I'm going to come up, and notice here's the cell. I'm going to click on this percentage button. Now this percentage button over in Excel does percentage with 0 decimals. If I click this in the data model, it does percentage with 2 decimals. Now our next calculation, which actually is going to be percentage change for gross profit, we're actually going to have to do it in 2 steps. And I need a formula, a DAX measure, that will always know to go back to the previous period and get the actual amount, so I can use it to compare it to this period's gross profit. Well, the way we do that is with the calculate function. But we're going to call this gross profit, same period last year, colon, equal sign. And we're going to use the amazing calculate function. Now the calculate function, you can put any expression there, which is a DAX measure. And for us, it's going to be square bracket. And I'm going to do total gross profit. Because what I need to do with calculate is I want total gross profit to see the filter context, which means it'll see the fiscal period for this particular row in the pivot table, comma. And then we add a filter which will change the filter context. So even though total gross profit and calculate will see whatever date period sits in the row header, I'm going to change the filter context by using, you got to be kidding me, the same period last year. And this function works on dates only. So it says dates, please give me, and you always put in the date column. That's that first column in our calendar table. And together, same period in last year, calculate and total gross profit. That whole formula will always get the amount from the previous period. Now I'm going to close parentheses and actually hit enter. And we're going to build a pivot table and prove that this formula is doing what we hope it's going to do. I'm going to click on pivot table. New worksheet is fine, so I hit enter. Now we go to calendar, and I want fiscal period. There's all of our fiscal periods. Now in a pivot table, if I drag a measure and I'm going to drag total gross profit down to values, of course, each one of these formulas sees the criteria in the row header. So right now, it sees 2015 quarter 3, and that's the correct amount for that quarter. But watch what happens when we use calculate and same period last year acting on the gross profit measure. Right here, there it is. Third quarter 2015, that's the amount for this quarter, but check that out, 26 million. That's exactly same period last year. There's the third quarter for 2014. So that formula will actually be used to compare then these two amounts to get the percentage change. Now I'm going to right-click and delete this sheet, back over to the data model. Now, there's a few ways we can calculate percentage change. I'm going to take the end amount divided by the begin amount minus 1. Now, I'm going to come up to the formula bar, and we're going to call this, I called it gross profit percentage change, colon, equal sign, square brackets, and it's going to be total gross profit. So for any row in the pivot table, that'll be the current amount, and I'm going to divide it by square bracket, and I'm going to arrow down to get gross profit same period last year, and then subtract 1. Enter. I'm going to add some percentage number formatting, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to go look at this because there's going to be a problem with that formula, and we'll have to figure out how to fix it. So I'm going to create a pivot table, new sheet, fiscal period, drag total gross profit so we can see all of them, gross profit same period last year, and percentage change. Now, the formulas here worked correctly. It took 8.5 million divided by that amount, subtracted 1, and that was a big decrease. But look it up here. The reason we're getting a num error is because for these periods, there is no previous period. So we need a way to show nothing in our pivot table. So I'm going to delete this sheet again, go back to our data model, and up here in the formula bar, we're going to use the if function. Equals if, and the logical test is going to be square brackets, down arrow, if the gross profit, same period last year, if you are equal to 0, that's going to be our logical test, comma. Result if true, I want to show nothing if it's 0 last period. And we don't put double quotes. We use the blank function in DAX, comma. And then the result if false is, there it's going to run our formula. Come to the end, close parentheses, and enter. Now, I only want the percent gross profit and gross profit percentage change. I don't want this one, so watch this. Right over in the measured grid, I'm going to right-click, hide from client tool, and there it will no longer show up in our pivot table field list. Now I'm going to click pivot table, enter. And now with our new DAX measures, there's our fiscal period. And all I want is total gross profit, percentage gross profit, and there is our gross profit percentage change. Go up to design, report, layout, show in tabular, and maybe a little style. So there it is. Two new DAX measures, one for percentage gross profit for this particular period, and then here is the percentage change compared to the previous period. I'm going to come down here, double click, and call this gross profit analysis, and enter. Wow, that was an epic video all about data modeling and building DAX formulas. Of course, we started over in Power Query importing multiple Excel files. Then we went over to our data model, imported, built relationships, built a calculated column, here in the transaction table, also over in the D calendar table, and then built a bunch of measures, built our pivot tables and reports, and when the source data change, everything refreshed. All right, we'll see you next video.